Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're talking about modern ideas about God. We started with biblical, medieval philosophy, Kabbalah. We're talking about ideas about God as they might pertain to our davening. We've talked about two modern thinkers so far, Mordechai Kaplan first, and then Rav Kook second. That was kind of a zigzag. We're going to continue to zigzag. I've never taught this material before, I confess, so I don't really have, probably when we're all done with it, I'll probably say, okay, this should have been the order. But at the moment, I don't really have an order. So today we're going to be doing Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. That'll take about 2 weeks, a contemporary theologian and thinker. And then we're going to move on to Heschel. So from Rav Kook to Yitz Greenberg to Heschel is another zig and a zag. And we might do Jonathan Sachs. We might do Rav Soloveitchik. We'll do Brad Artson. And then I think we'll wrap it up. Okay. So Rabbi Irving Greenberg is an American modern Orthodox rabbi and thinker and theologian. He's in his 90s now. He lives in Yerushalayim. He was actually a really important public figure in modern Orthodoxy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Deborah, did he do your parents' wedding? He officiated at my wife's parents' wedding, my in-laws' wedding. He was known as he was sort of the American, without being a Sir Lord, kind of the Jonathan Sachs of his day, meaning he was the contemporary, he was Orthodox, but could speak to contemporary people in language that they could understand and in a way that was very appealing. And he recently, about 2 years ago, maybe a year or two ago, published a book called The Triumph of Life, which is kind of his magnum opus summary of all of his theological thinking. And he starts from the following place. This is not necessarily crucial to know in terms of understanding his theology. It's just it's interesting to know in terms of how it developed. And he talks about this quite clearly. He was ordained, I think, in the 50s. He came of age in the early 60s. And he says how in the early 60s, he really started 50s, 60s, he started studying a lot about the Shoah, the Holocaust, and says he was, sort of tried to come to grips conceptually with the enormity of it, the enormity of the horror, in particular, the death of so many children during the Shoah, 1.5 Jewish children, others of other groups, obviously, also, but 1.5 million Jewish children. And this posed for him theological dilemmas of how could God allow such a thing to happen? There are traditional explanations for why bad things happen. So the first temple was destroyed, and thinkers after it said that's because of idol worship. Second temple was destroyed. The sages came up with the idea that was because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred. The Shoah took place, and there are, more right-wing Orthodox thinkers who have an explanation for that. And that is, it was God's punishment. God allowed it to happen because Judaism in Europe started becoming too secularized. People fell away from Torah. So from within I will call it a traditional theological framework, the Shoah is explainable. This did not work for Rabbi Irving Greenberg. Everyone calls him Yitz Greenberg. Everyone calls him Yitz. So he couldn't buy that. Couldn't wrap his head around that. Just didn't buy it. So he said it can't be that the horrors of the Shoah was somehow part of God's plan, that God allowed that to happen. I simply can't accept that idea theologically. And yet, I am a traditional Torah-believing Jew. And so now we're going to read about how he squared the circle. So the way he squared the circle, just to foreshadow and tell you the bottom line, he developed a theory, which was, I think, pretty unique, that Judaism has had three ages: the biblical age, the rabbinic age, and the modern age. And God's role is different in each of those three ages. Okay? I'll just tell you again the bottom line. And that God has gradually retreated from intervention in human history until in the third age, which is our own, God has elected to not intervene in human history. That doesn't mean that God exists, that God doesn't exist, but God has elected to not intervene in human history, and everything is up to human beings. Okay? Now, if you remember back to, I don't know, some class you might have taken in college or something, you might have learned that this goes back to sort of modern philosophers. There is a difference between theism and deism, if you remember back to those words. Theism meant that God, theos, is involved in the world. The deists, who people tell us, some of our founding fathers, the American, the Thomas Jefferson crew, that they were deists, although they didn't invent this idea. I think it was some philosopher. I don't know which philosopher, because I didn't take the intro to philosophy class. The deists believed in the idea of God as the watchmaker. God made the watch, wound up the watch, and walked away from it, right? God was the creator who created everything, but then doesn't intervene. No watch winding, okay? It's a self-winding watch. God created a self-winding perpetual watch, and God does not intervene, as opposed to the theists who said, no, God does make decisions and intervene. The deists said, and again, theos and deos, they're just like different words for God. So it's kind of the philosophers who made up this distinction between theists and deists, right? The deists said God was the creator and then doesn't do stuff, as opposed to the traditional belief, which is, God decides who shall live and who shall die, etc. So this is kind of, you could say, Greenberg's version of deism, and he makes it into a typology of three ages, okay? And this will have impact on why we pray. I don't think we're going to get into why we pray until next week. This week we're going to focus on just understanding his theory. We're going to read some of his text to understand his theory of the three ages of Judaism, which involve three differing, changing stages of God's involvement in the world. Okay? That's what we're going to do today. Don't ask me questions yet about the three stages, because let us actually read some of that text together. Okay, I'm going to find it, and then I'm going to screen share it from his book, The Triumph of Life. I recommend the book. By the way, even if you are not a theologian, it is a fairly easy read. He writes really clearly. He explains his ideas clearly. He has a lot to say about Jewish history, about modernity, about Tikkun Olam, about science. It's a really interesting book. I really recommend it, The Triumph of Life. Here we go. Here I am near the top of the page. I have come to see the covenant. He says that he focuses a lot on covenant. A relationship between God and Israel is a covenant, which means an agreement. There are two sides. I've come to see the covenant as unfolding in three stages, each initiated by God through divine contraction, or tzimtzum. He uses the Kabbalistic word. We've seen this before, where God voluntarily chooses to contract God's self, but reshaped by the response of the people Israel. The three eras are the biblical era, the rabbinic era, and the lay era. Okay? In the first phase of covenant, biblical era, God reached out to Israel as a parent would to a child. I would skip the next sentence. Don't worry about it. At that time, the children of Israel were an enslaved minority. As a loving parent, God invited Israel to join in the covenantal process at the people's own level of functioning. When did God do that? By the way, like at Mount Sinai. You be my partners, I'm giving you the Torah. In this stage, God performed many tasks for God's human partners and dominated many of these joint projects. God gave the Israelites detailed directions on how to live, along with promised rewards for living the covenantal way and punishments for failing to do so. Hence, God was very much the controlling partner in the breed. So too, when the Israelites were enslaved and crushed in spirit, God initiated their emancipation by sending Moses. All right? So all of this is kind of familiar to us from the Torah, meaning in stage 1, the biblical stage of our covenant, God was like the parent. God gave instructions of what we ought to do, stipulating rewards and punishments like a parent, and God intervened when necessary like a parent, meaning doing miracles. Next page, top of the next page. In like paternalistic fashion, God revealed the Torah at Sinai, speaking in a voice from heaven, with signs and phenomena that awed the people who then accepted the covenant. Thus, the pattern was set in the desert for the whole Bible, meaning what we read about in the book of Exodus sets the pattern for the entire biblical age, stage 1 of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. The Israelites' fate was not so much determined by their actions in the world as by their behavior toward God. When they had faith, showed trust, and obeyed God, their enemies were defeated. When they lacked faith, or turned to foreign gods, they were punished and defeated. All that makes sense, right? So if you just said, oh, okay, that's like superficial meaning of the Bible 101. Top of the next page, about 4 lines down. This was an age of visible miracles and of prophets directly bearing messages from God. Okay? So, era 1, biblical age, and I think that requires very little explanation. That's kind of the pshat of the Bible. God gives direction, God reveals, God specifies rewards and punishment, God enacts the rewards and punishments when appropriate. When we follow God's will, good things happen. When we leave God, bad things happen. And God's in charge of all that, and God intervenes in history, and that explains the presence of miracles. Does anyone have any question about that? If so, stop me now and ask. That's stage 1. Stage 2, the rabbinic era. From the 2nd century, I'm on the page called because I know there are people who are reading this at home. Page 172. From the 2nd century BCE on, however, a group of teachers arose in Israel who brought a new understanding of the relationship with God. Initially, they had no title, but around the 1st century CE, they started to call themselves rabbis. They offered a new conception of the human role in the covenant and of Israel's relationship with God. Over the next 6 centuries, they reached out to Jews everywhere, teaching their Torah, and gradually they won the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. They started their work before the destruction of the Second Temple, but the crushing of the center of the old religious life, together with the new conditions of dependence and exile, sealed their victory as the religious guide to the Jewish people. So, rabbinic Judaism taking over from biblical Judaism, rabbinic Judaism conceptually succeeding biblical Judaism, last years of the Second Temple and after the destruction of the Second Temple, what we also call the Rabbinic Age or the Talmudic Age. Okay? The schools gave birth to rabbinic I believe that the schools that gave birth to the rabbinic movement grew in response to now pay attention, new covenantal initiative given by God to Israel and the nations, meaning stage 2 of the covenant. It's going to change now. After more than a millennium of covenantal living, the Israelites had come to internalize the covenantal regime of life, meaning we got it. Everything that the Torah teaches, we got it. We understand. Recognizing that they were now capable of living at a higher, more responsible level of religious life, God, please pay attention, I'm going to start that sentence again, bottom of 172. Recognizing that they, which means we, the Jewish people, were now capable of living at a higher, more responsible level of religious life, God became less transcendent, less out there, and more hidden and immanent in Jewish life. This is a paradox kind of in his thinking, and Yitz Greenberg's thinking, that the more hidden God becomes, the more God is accessible to us. In phase 1, God is very dominant, but God is out there somewhere, going poof. In phase 2, God starts to become more hidden and yet more present. I know that's a paradox, top of the next page. In dialing down the divine voltage, which is a phrase that I love, so funny, in dialing down the divine voltage, God intended to come closer to the people. Rabbinic tradition popularized a new name for God, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, connoting a new understanding of God, more intimate, personal, and present, less dangerous, controlling, and intervening in history. And that's why in the Talmudic era, God doesn't make miracles, okay? Why? Divine self-limitation was designed to call the Jews to a more active role in the covenant. Of course, he is, modeling this idea. Notice when he started that, when he said phase one, biblical phase was like, we're the child, he kind of models this on the lifespan, okay? So phase two is kind of like adolescence and early adulthood, all right? God is less present. You know the rules. You've internalized the rules. I'm going to stop doing this national reward and punishment thing. I am quieter, less powerful, in a less I'm circling this, less dangerous and controlling, but I'm really present to you all the time. So I'm not the God of thunder and lightning at Sinai. I am the Shekhinah. This outreach to Israel, inviting the people to undertake a second higher, by the way, this is for what I'm about to read now is important for his theology. It's not so important for our understanding of the Siddur, but it's a really interesting part of his theology. This outreach to Israel, inviting the people to undertake a second, higher level of covenantal responsibility, was matched by a divine initiative to the nations. Even as the biblical religion morphed into rabbinic Judaism, by God's will, one breakaway from biblical Judaism grew into Christianity, consistent with the divine love for all of humanity and desire to partner with human beings. This outreach to the Gentiles would engage them at the entry level of covenant, as was initially done with the children of Israel. This took the form of Christianity's separation and emergence from Judaism. It is no mere coincidence that Christianity materialized and developed at the same time as Judaism entered its second rabbinic phase of the covenant. In other words, Christianity is part of God's plan. Christianity is part of the spreading of the covenantal idea. By the way, I believe he would totally agree with saying Islam also. He didn't write, I don't know if he wrote about that, but I do know that Yitzhak Greenberg in the 60s, in particular 60s and 70s, was extremely involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue and relations, had a relationship with the Vatican. Vatican II in 1960, whatever, was very important. He did a lot of dialogue groups with Christians, particularly with Catholics, and had great respect for Christianity. So as part of his theology, instead of saying Christianity is a misunderstanding aberration of Judaism, which would be a traditional Jewish view, he says it's actually a different version of the covenant, which spreads ideas of the covenant to a broader population in the world. Everyone follow that? As the rabbis interpreted the divine signal, the divine was self-limiting. Again, in later Kabbalistic tradition, which we read, this movement came to be called tzimtzum, a divine contraction meant to leave room for something besides God. Henceforth, there would no longer be revelation in the form of a divine. I'm going to read that more slowly. Henceforth, there would no longer be revelation in the form of a divine voice speaking from heaven. Okay, now this is a question. I'm going to stop sharing briefly, if I could find my cursor. Question for the audience. Okay, if divine revelation no longer comes in phase 2 from God speaking from heaven, how do we know what God's will is? What do you think he's going to say in the rabbinic era? How do we know what God's will is if there's no more prophecy? The rabbis. And how do the rabbis figure it out? They debate the sources, and they say, what does this mean? Rabbi X says it's forbidden. Rabbi Y says it's permitted, and we debate it and debate Midrash, and then we come to a conclusion. Hillel and Shammai, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi canonizing the Mishnah and deciding what to keep in and what to keep out, and then the academies in Babylonia arguing about it. So yes, he says, correct. Who mumbled that? I think that was Paul, right? Yeah? Yes? No? I thought I recognized Paul's voice mumbling the answer. The correct answer. The rabbis debated about the revelation they'd been given, and they figured out what the revelation means. So Rabbi Greenberg says this is part of God's plan in phase 2. Phase 1 was, I told you all the rules. Phase 2 is, Now I want you to figure out how those rules apply. And what do you think he cites as the story that proves this point, that God is less involved in revelation? The story that all rabbis like to cite, Rabbi Eliezer versus the other sages, and they say you're wrong, and he says I'm right, and they say majority rules, and he says if I am right, let the walls of the Beit Midrash start leaning, and the walls start leaning, and they say we don't care, we don't believe in that, and they say and he says if I'm right, let the water in the river start flowing backwards, and the water starts flowing backwards, and the rabbis in the Beit Midrash say we don't care. That's not how we decide things. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let a voice come out from heaven, and then an echo or a bat kol comes out from heaven saying, listen to Rabbi Eliezer, he's right. And the rabbis in the Beit Midrash respond by saying what? Anyone remember? You can paraphrase. They say, we don't listen to voices from heaven. Torah's not in heaven. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. Torah's on earth. We don't pay any attention to voices from heaven. So this is the story that exemplifies the transition to phase 2 of the covenant in the rabbinic era. God is not actively revealing. God has given the rules to the child, and it is now up to the developing human, which is the metaphor for the people Israel, to work on figuring out what God meant. It's up to us to interpret the covenant. God isn't going to come and speak anymore, and it's up to humans to figure it out. That's phase 2. And he talks about phase 2 is more of a partnership where God is the more, let's call it, quiet partner. Everyone with me? Are there any questions about that? We're about to get to phase 3. Any questions about phase 2? Holler. Was there a mumble? Was there a question? No? Is it clear?
I'm just having trouble hearing you over the AC and sanctuary.
Okay, I can't do anything about the AC in the sanctuary. I'll try to talk louder. Okay, I hope it's recording. All right. Now I'm going to go share again. Share. Can I share? I'm going to go share again. I just wanted to see you for a while. Okay. You see the piece of paper?
No.
All
right.
It's getting ready to load.
Okay. Tell me when. Very frustrating. I'm sorry.
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Good. Thank you. So that was phase 2. Last paragraph on the page, he tells the Rabbi Eliezer story, right? The Torah is not in the heavens. We don't care. Right? We don't care, right? That's not how we do it. Top of the next page. Henceforth, in this new period, Israel would know God's will and directions through discussion and consensus. God was calling on humans to step up and actively discover God's instruction. By the way, more about the rabbinic period. I think we're going to end with phase 2 today, and we'll go on next week to phase 3 and prayer. Second paragraph on page 174. The rabbis taught that because the infinite divine wisdom was directed at all people and for all time, remember a corollary of phase 2 is that the covenant is being broadened, okay? It could include Christians doing things their own way, or maybe other peoples interpreting God's word. Because the infinite divine wisdom was now meant to spread, God's word had multiple levels of meaning. The initial recipients, meaning the biblical people, had only heard the surface meaning of Torah. They may not have been equipped to detect or understand the other levels. Perhaps these had been broadcast on a wavelength that the culture of their time could not yet receive. Now, in the new rabbinic era, Tzimtzum, God's contraction, paved the way for the Jewish people to receive Torah on those hitherto undetected wavelengths. Now, wise people who learn Torah use their intelligence and judgment to reanalyze classic sources. This explains why there could be disagreements, right? There couldn't be any disagreement in what the Bible actually said, but there could be disagreement in what the Bible meant, okay? Line 2 in the next page, top of the next page. The rabbis even initiated the language of shutafut, or partnership. So we are now partners with God. God stopped visibly speaking directly to humans, but the rabbis understood that the covenantal conversation must not stop. The deep connection between God and humanity could not be lost. God's silence, they saw, was not a withdrawal from the dialogue, but was intended to evoke greater human activity. It meant humans should speak to God. I take it back. There's a little bit about prayer in today's class. Okay, so he's saying the fact that God chose to become less active doesn't mean that God was more checked out and didn't care. It means that God says, we're partners. Hey, how about if you talk to me sometime? It meant humans should speak to God. This was the driving force for the expansion of prayer and its installation, meaning prayer's installation, as the central channel of divine service. What was the main channel of divine service in the Bible? Someone yell it out. How do you serve God? Sacrifices, which is done by specific people at very specific times and places in a very specific way. Okay? But as God is stepping back from history, God is saying, no, I'm enlarging the covenant, and now anyone can connect with me at any time in your own way. You don't need the sacrifice. You don't need the temple. You don't need Kohanim, priests. Okay? You now have this thing called prayer. Prayer's installation as the central channel of divine service. In a world where God was more hidden, people would be more engaged and less mere observers of ritual. He's implying that in the biblical era, if there's sacrifice in general, I am just an observer of ritual, which is being done in the temple. I bring my sheep to the temple. That's what I do. And then the Kohanim take over. They do the ritual to make me feel connected to God. I'm just an observer, okay? But since God would not be encountered in a manifest way, such as experiencing the divine presence in the temple, the prayer service would connect people to God at a new internal level. Let's go on a little more, even though it's not highlighted. The Psalms would illuminate God's presence in nature. That's a pretty familiar idea to us. While blessings would connect people to God as creator. That's also pretty familiar to us. All the while, remembrance of the redemption in the Exodus confirmed God's presence in history and God's availability in the life of the congregation. The rabbis also coined hundreds of blessings that made the hidden divine presence manifest. I just want to add a little bit. There's another consequence of God's tzimtzum or contraction, a more immanent, and again, immanent with an A means present, okay, as opposed to transcendent, far away, present locally. A more immanent, more hidden God. I just want you to grasp the paradox. I'm more hidden, but that means I'm available in more places. When I'm clearly revealed, I'm available there, but not there. I'm on Sinai, but not on some other mountain, okay? When I'm immanent, you can access me on any mountain and any valley and in any place. This is part of the theology, the understanding of theology. A more immanent, more hidden God actually had come closer to human beings. Before, the area of holiness was confined to limited manifest places, like the temple, where the divine force had to be shielded and mediated by priests so that regular individuals would not be harmed by the close encounter with God. Now the home, where kosher food could be prepared, blessings said, and limited purification rites like ritual hand washings conducted, the home could become the locus of sacred meals before God. The areas and details of halachic observance expanded considerably. The divine was more hidden, but the divine presence could be experienced everywhere. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I want to see your faces. Okay, so basically I just want to summarize this, and then we'll pause for question comments, and then we'll wrap up, and we're going to go on to the third phase next week. Okay, so in the first phase is pretty easy because it's kind of pshat to the Bible. God intervenes, gives instructions, tells you what to do, reward and punishment, actually executes those rewards and punishments, and intervenes and does miracles. We're pretty familiar with that. Phase 2, the rabbinic phase, God steps back. I love the phrase, God lowers the divine voltage, becomes more hidden, less apparent. That's what the word manifest means. Less visibly apparent, more hidden. The paradox is more hidden means more present everywhere. The covenant actually becomes broader. It spreads to the whole Jewish people and actually other people who interpret the covenant, including Christians and presumably Muslims, although his thing isn't dialogue with Muslims. His thing career-wise was dialogue with Christians. Humans interpret God's will. That's what all that Mishnah and Talmud and Halacha business is about. And as part of the paradox that God is more hidden, but therefore more present, I want you to hold on to that, right? More hidden, but more present. Therefore, you can access God anywhere. Prayer, kashrut, Shabbat, business dealings. He would expand the whole thing, everything that Halacha talks about. They're all ways of grasping God's, sensing God's presence and choosing to be in covenant or partnership with God at all places and all times. That's why Torah mitzvos are just about do these things here and in this place. Rabbinic mitzvot spread throughout the day and the life, all right? Their interpretation of Torah recognizes that God has stepped back to a certain extent. We are supposed to be partners with God. We are supposed to be more active. We interpret God's will. We understand that the covenant spreads throughout many areas of life. And as part of being in partnership with God, we search for God also. And we do that through prayer. I'm just going to pause with that. We're not going to get up to the third phase where he's going to have more to say about modernity and prayer. I just want to take a pause. Okay. And he actually says these are 3 stages on purpose, intentional in God's relationship with the Jewish people, just like, again, he doesn't hammer on this over and over again, but he basically is thinking just like human beings have different stages in relationship to their parents. In the first stage, your parent tells you everything to do and punishes you if your hands is in the cookie jar, and they appear to be all powerful, okay? At a certain point, the parent steps back and says, well, I've given you instructions, and now you need to figure it out, okay? I'm going to pause and give a few minutes. We don't have a lot of people in the gallery today. Give a few minutes for questions or comment. Thoughts? Bernie, is there a hand up?
Yeah, let me. I have a comment. Yeah, I have a comment. It sort of pertains to the subject. There's a book that I just read, "To Be a Jew Today" by Noah Feldman.
Yep.
I don't know if you know him, but I really enjoyed it, and I sent it to my emeritus rabbi in San Bernardino. He enjoyed it, but he was critical, and I really think it's an easy read. $14. You know his background.
But go ahead.
Yeah.
What did you read here?
I think it addresses what people think about God, how they address God, the different parts of Judaism, how they relate. He was raised modern Orthodox.
Okay. And is there a particular, thank you for that, and is there a particular thing in the book that got jogged for you by class today?
No, he mentions Yitzhak Greenberg, and I know, I don't know a lot about him, but I know he's mainly addressing about God, the same thing you mentioned today.
Okay.
People are always trying to seek God,
Yep.
whether it's keeping kosher the way Julie does, there are other things. And so, why does someone keep kosher? Why does secular people do?
Right. So this is good. So this is what Yitz is trying to explain. By the way, you can anticipate, of course. Well, I'll just foreshadow for you in one sentence or 2 sentences. Look ahead. What do you think the third phase is? In the third phase, God goes totally quiet. The Tzimtzum goes further, and it's 100% our job to execute the divine will. And just to foreshadow, and Yitz is very big on science. He basically says scientists who are trying to cure disease are actually fulfilling God's will. By the way, this gets back to the title of his book, The Triumph of Life. He says God is God is about everything that is life, that enhances life, that strengthens life, that magnifies life, that prolongs life, and God is against everything that squelches life. Okay? So he basically says, the people who invented antibiotics are part of the covenant. They don't know that. Or, maybe in the 19th century they were still religious and they knew that. And they said, I'm doing God's will. Modern people certainly usually don't, okay? But they really are. So people who are working to try to improve life. He talks about increased sanitation, eradicating disease, reducing poverty and hunger. He says that all the people who are involved in these things, whether they're scientists or human rights activists, are all doing God's will. They are actually enacting the third, you could say in the second phase, he would say, I think, in the second stage, God's covenant spreads to the world through Christianity. And I think he would say in the third phase, God's covenant spreads to the world through science broadly construed, meaning human beings working on endeavors to improve human life. He also says, just to anticipate a potential objection, that if science is not guided by God consciousness and awareness of the covenant, then science can be used for evil purposes. The gas chambers, right? Scientists not guided by God consciousness. So it's not that science in and of itself is the next stage of the covenant, but that the next stage of the covenant becomes manifest through human beings working in the world to improve human life. And he says that that needs to be guided by the guidelines of the covenant. All right. So that's stage 3. I foreshadowed that for you. And so we'll read something about that next week. And then we're going to loop back and see that he talks a little more about what prayer can mean in the third phase. So I just want to take a step back, take one more minute to wrap it up. Why is he doing this? You know, it's the princess and the pea. Okay. What's the grain of sand that's irritating to the oyster that creates the genesis of the pearl? The grain of sand for him is the Holocaust, the senselessness of the suffering of the Holocaust. He simply cannot accept the idea of a God who can do miracles, but allowed the Shoah to happen. The traditional Jewish view of God is God can choose to do miracles, but chose to allow 1.5 million Jews to be killed in the Shoah. 1.5 million children, Jewish children, to be killed in the Shoah. He cannot accept the idea. That's the pea under the mattress, okay? What he ends up evolving to be able to square I always call this squaring the circle, or, how you can sleep at night with apparent contradictions theologically. So he does that by saying, okay, that's because that thing about God intervening in history to do miracles, that was a phase that's over now. That doesn't happen anymore. God chooses in phase 2 and phase 3 to not intervene, because God's choice is, it's up to you people. You allowed the Shoah to happen, you human beings. I didn't allow it to happen. I am like the adult who's left everything up to you, right? I am the parent. The parent is not saying to the 35-year-old, you are making a dangerous left turn. Don't do that. The parent is saying, I taught you how to drive. Now it's up to you, and I'm not there telling you what to do. And if you make mistakes, you make your own mistakes, right? So he's squaring the circle, and what he's trying to reconcile is an idea from the Torah that God can choose to act in history and make miracles, yet God chose not to act in the Shoah, not to intervene. How is that possible? Answer is because God changed God's modus operandi in the world, leaving stage 1, going into stage 2, and that way of doing it is tzimtzum. God voluntarily chose to contract not God's presence, but God's manifest activity. But ironically, God then becomes more accessible and more present. God is more present everywhere, yet less active in an intrusive, powerful way. I just want to let you chew on that for a week. When I say less powerful, I mean less manifestation of power. His catchy phrase lowered the divine voltage.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.